It was the summer of 2013 when I started working part-time at the Jefferson County Library. It's an old building established in 1885 with creaky wooden floors and stained glass windows that cast eerie colors across the walls as the sun shifted throughout the day. I needed the money, so I ignored the rumors, the whispers about strange occurrences and unsettling experiences, but I'll never forget what happened during my final shift. The library closed at 8 p.m., but it was always my job to stay until 9 to shelve books and tidy up. That night, the air felt heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, but they always did that, so I brushed it off. The silence of the library felt deeper than usual, though. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a building filled with books. It was an oppressive kind of silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Around 8:30, I was shelving books in the history section, tucked away in the farthest corner of the library. The area was dimly lit, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. I remember humming softly to myself to shake off the eerie feeling when I heard it, a soft whisper. It was so faint I almost didn't catch it, but it sounded like my name. Emma? I froze, clutching the book in my hand. The whisper was too clear to be my imagination, yet when I turned around there was no one there. I laughed nervously to myself, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the building settling or the wind outside. I forced myself to keep working. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time louder, more insistent. Emma. The voice was raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was just an auditory hallucination. That's a thing, right? The human brain is weird like that. Then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around so fast I nearly dropped the book I was holding, but again, no one was there. The aisles were empty. I could see all the way down to the other end of the section, and there wasn't a soul in sight. At this point, I decided I'd had enough of the history section. I moved to the children's area, thinking the bright colors and cheerful decorations would help. But that's when things got worse. I was shelving a picture book when I heard the faint sound of laughter. Children's laughter. It echoed softly, almost as if it was coming from the walls themselves. I knew for a fact I was the only one in the library. Still, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice trembled more than I wanted it to. The laughter stopped abruptly, and in its place came a rhythmic tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers on wood. It seemed to be coming from the reading nook, a cozy little area with beanbags and tiny chairs. As I approached, the tapping stopped. The air in the nook was freezing, much colder than the rest of the library. Then I saw it. One of the beanbags shifted slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. My blood ran cold, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the empty beanbag, waiting for I don't know what. "Why are you here?" The voice was louder now, and it came from directly behind me. I spun around, and there she was, a little girl, no older than 7 or 8. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes... God, her eyes were empty, just dark voids staring back at me. She was wearing a tattered dress that looked like it belonged in the 19th century, and her hair hung in limp, dirty strands around her face. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She tilted her head and smiled, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. "Why are you here?" she repeated, her voice dripping with malice. Finally, I found my voice. I work here. I'm just doing my job." Her smile faded, and for a moment she looked almost sad. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't be here. They don't like it." Before I could ask who they were, the lights in the library went out, plunging me into darkness. I screamed, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. When I finally managed to turn it on, the girl was gone. But the tapping sound had returned, louder this time, echoing from all around me. Panicking, I ran toward the front desk, but the library seemed different, as if the layout had shifted. The aisles were longer, the shelves taller, and the shadows seemed alive. They moved in ways shadows shouldn't, twisting and reaching toward me. I could hear whispers now, dozens of them, overlapping and chaotic. My name was in there, repeated over and over, mingled with other words I couldn't quite make out. The air was so cold I could see my breath in front of me. "Emma, leave. Now." I reached the front desk, my hands shaking as I grabbed my bag. I didn't care about clocking out or locking up. I just needed to get out. As I ran toward the door, I heard one final blood-curdling scream. It wasn't human. It was something deeper, more primal. and it seemed to shake the entire building. The door wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked with all my strength, but it was as if it had been welded shut. Then I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows. They were tall, faceless things with elongated limbs, and they moved with unnatural jerks and twitches. They surrounded me. Their hollow faces turned toward me as if they were watching, waiting. I don't know how, but the door finally gave way, and I stumbled outside, collapsing onto the sidewalk. When I turned back, the library was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I quit the next day and never went back. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that raspy voice whispering my name. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see her, the little girl with the empty eyes, smiling at me from the darkness.
Story number 2.
The Jefferson County Library isn't just a library. It's a relic of the past, steeped in age and mystery. Rumors swirled around the place like smoke, stories of ghostly apparitions, books flying off shelves, and whispers in the dark. I never believed them. I should have. I started as a night custodian during my senior year of college, drawn by the promise of decent pay and quiet hours. My shifts were from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., long after the last patrons had left. At first, it was peaceful. Just me, the mop, and rows of ancient books. But then the nights began to change. It started small, lights flickering, strange cold spots in the stacks, and the occasional feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination or the quirks of an old building. But soon, I couldn't ignore it. One night, I was cleaning the basement archive, a cramped, dimly lit room filled with leather-bound books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. As I was wiping down the shelves, I heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to come from deeper in the archive, where the light barely reached. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. It sounded like fingernails drumming on wood. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured deeper into the archive. The air grew colder with each step, and the tapping grew louder. My heart was pounding as I turned the final corner, and then it stopped. Silence. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the shelves, but there was nothing there. Just books, dust, and shadows. I laughed nervously to myself, but as I turned to leave, I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the silence was deafening. I bolted out of the archive and didn't go back for the rest of the night. A few days later, I was cleaning the main reading room when I noticed something strange. One of the chairs at a study table was pulled out, even though no one had been there all night. As I approached, I saw a book open on the table, its yellowed pages blank except for a single phrase scrawled in red ink. "They are watching." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone enter the library, and I hadn't left my station. I closed the book and placed it back on the shelf, trying to convince myself it was some elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew better. The next night, I was in the children's section when the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I heard it again, the tapping, this time accompanied by faint laughter. Children's laughter, high-pitched and distorted, as if it were coming from a broken record. I shone my flashlight around, but the room was empty. Then I saw it, a shadow darting across the far wall, impossibly fast. My pulse raced as I followed the shadow into the adjacent aisle, but there was nothing there, just rows of books and silence. I decided I'd had enough for one night and made my way to the janitor's closet to pack up. As I turned the corner, I froze. The door to the closet was wide open, and inside every single item had been pulled off the shelves and thrown onto the floor. In the middle of the mess was a single word, written in what looked like ash: "Leave." I didn't clean it up. I didn't even grab my bag. I just ran. But the worst night came a week later. It was nearing the end of my shift, and I was sweeping the lobby when I heard the sound of a piano. The library didn't have a piano. The notes were slow and mournful, echoing through the empty halls. I felt drawn to it, like a moth to a flame, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The sound led me to the auditorium, a part of the library that hadn't been used in years. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing rows of dusty chairs and a grand piano on the stage. The keys moved on their own, playing a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. As I stepped closer, the music stopped abruptly and the room fell into an oppressive silence. Then, from the shadows behind the piano, a figure emerged. It was a man, or at least, it had been at some point. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and glowing faintly. He was dressed in tattered clothing that looked like it belonged to another century. He raised a hand, pointing directly at me. "Get out," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You don't belong here." I stumbled back, my legs barely carrying me as I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear the chairs scraping against the floor, as if being dragged by unseen hands. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers started again. Dozens of voices, overlapping and incomprehensible, but all filled with malice. When I reached the lobby, the front doors wouldn't open. I yanked on them desperately, but they didn't budge. Then I felt it, a presence behind me, cold and malevolent. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his hollow eyes boring into mine. "You should have listened," he said. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the piano starting up again, its mournful notes echoing in my ears. I woke up outside, lying on the cold stone steps of the library. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the building. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't even tell anyone what had happened. I just left. That was 10 years ago. I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of a piano playing, faint and mournful, as if calling me back. I've heard other stories since then about people who didn't leave when they were warned. They weren't as lucky as I was. If you ever find yourself in an old library late at night and you hear the whispers, the tapping, or the music, leave. Don't look back. Don't ask questions. Just go. Because some places aren't meant to be disturbed.
Story number 3.
It was the fall of 2008 when I took the position of assistant librarian at the Montrose Public Library. The building was a Gothic masterpiece, its towering spires and ornate carvings casting long shadows on the streets below. It was beautiful by day, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, it transformed into something sinister. I had heard the whispers about the place, stories of ghostly apparitions, strange sounds, and books that moved on their own. But I dismissed them as small-town gossip. I was a skeptic, always had been. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, at least not until that night. My first late shift was on a Tuesday. The library closed at 8 p.m., but I was tasked with staying until 11 to reorganize the special collections section on the top floor. It was a quiet night, with only a handful of patrons trickling in and out. By 8:30, the library was empty, and I was alone. The top floor housed the rare and antique books, leather-bound tomes with cracked spines and pages so fragile they threatened to disintegrate at a touch. The air up there always smelled faintly of dust and mildew, and the dim lighting made the place feel otherworldly. I set to work, shelving books in alphabetical order and trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Around 9 p.m., I heard the first sound, a soft rustling, like pages being turned. I paused, listening intently. The library was supposed to be empty, but the sound was unmistakable. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly through the aisles. No response. I walked toward the source of the noise, clutching the small flashlight I'd brought with me. The sound led me to a corner of the room where an old oak table sat beneath a stained glass window. A single book lay open on the table, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. But there was no breeze. The air was still, heavy. As I approached, the fluttering stopped. The book lay open to a page filled with strange symbols and illegible handwriting, the kind you'd expect to find in an ancient spell book. I reached out to close it, but the moment my fingers touched the cover, a loud bang echoed through the room. I jumped, spinning around. A book had fallen off a nearby shelf and lay splayed on the floor. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just gravity, an old shelf giving way. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I picked up the fallen book and replaced it on the shelf, then returned to the table to close the strange tome. As I did, I felt a sudden chill. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly I could see my breath. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and a deep sense of dread settled over me. Then I heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably a voice. "Leave." I froze. The whisper was soft, raspy, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. My rational mind screamed that it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. "Leave." It came again, louder this time. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, walking quickly toward the stairs. As I reached the top of the staircase, I glanced back over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the shadows at the far end of the room. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, but its eyes... Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the dark. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty building. I reached the main floor, breathing heavily, and grabbed my bag, ready to leave. But as I approached the front doors, they wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handles with all my strength, but they were locked, as if some unseen force was holding them shut. Panic set in. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen flickered and went black. I tried turning it on, but it was dead. The lights in the library began to flicker, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe on the walls. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Leave now. I ran to the circulation desk, hoping to find the spare key to the doors. As I rifled through the drawers, the air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the staircase. I turned to see the figure descending the stairs, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, searing fear I had never known before. "Why are you here?" it rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing, and my limbs refused to obey me. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating, and I could feel the temperature plummet with each step it took. "Leave, or you'll stay forever," it said, its voice dripping with malice. Finally, my legs obeyed, and I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I darted through the aisles, the shadows twisting and closing in around me. The whispers grew louder, joined by laughter, cold, mocking laughter that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I found myself in the children's section, the brightly colored decorations now grotesque and warped in the flickering light. A book fell from a shelf, landing at my feet. Its cover was blank, but when I opened it, the pages were filled with the same strange symbols as the book upstairs. And then, written in large, jagged letters, "You can't leave." I screamed, throwing the book aside, and ran toward the back entrance. The door was ajar, light spilling in from the streetlights outside. I didn't question it. I just ran through and didn't stop until I was halfway down the block. When I finally turned back, the library was dark and silent, its imposing facade betraying nothing of what I had experienced. I quit the next day, leaving my keys and a hastily written resignation note in the book drop. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that library, but sometimes late at night I dream of glowing eyes and hear whispers in the dark, and I wonder, did I really escape, or did I leave a part of myself behind?
Story number 4.
It was the winter of 2016 when I joined the staff at the Blackwood Public Library, a quaint yet imposing building nestled in the heart of a sleepy New England town. The library had stood there for over a century, its Gothic architecture and ivy-covered walls exuding an air of mystery. The locals loved to share tales about the library's haunted past, whispers of a tragedy that had occurred decades ago. A young librarian, Evelyn Graves, had vanished without a trace, her belongings left behind as if she had simply walked out of existence. I didn't pay much attention to the stories when I started my job. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, and the pay was too good to pass up. My shifts often ended late at night, long after the library's final patrons had left. It was during those quiet hours that I began to sense something was off. The first incident happened during my second week. I was in the archives, cataloging old records, when I felt a sudden chill. The room was always colder than the rest of the library, but this was different. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as a draft from the old ventilation system. Then I heard it, a faint humming, a tune so soft it was barely audible. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where the oldest and most fragile books were stored. I hesitated, but eventually called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The humming stopped. I walked over to the corner, my flashlight casting long, distorted shadows. There was no one there, only rows of dusty shelves. But one book caught my eye, a thin, leather-bound volume lying open on the floor. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was pristine, as though it had been written that very day. "She is waiting." I slammed the book shut and placed it back on the shelf, my hands trembling. I didn't mention it to anyone the next day. Who would believe me? Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated. Lights flickered erratically, footsteps echoed through empty halls, and books toppled from shelves with no explanation. Late at night, I often felt as if someone was watching me, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on my shoulders. But it wasn't until one particularly cold January night that I truly understood the depth of what I was dealing with. The library had just closed, and I was alone, tidying up the reading room. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9, its deep, resonant tone filling the silence. As the sound faded, I noticed something odd, a book lying open on one of the tables. I was certain I had cleared everything moments earlier. I approached the table cautiously. The book's title was faded, its cover worn smooth by time. The pages were blank except for a single word scrawled in red ink, "Help." I stared at the word, my pulse quickening. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. My flashlight barely pierced the shadows, the beam trembling in my unsteady hand. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. Then I heard it again, the humming. It was louder this time, closer, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. I swung the flashlight around, searching for the source, when I saw her. She was standing in the center of the room, her back to me. A woman in a long, tattered dress, her dark hair cascading down her back in tangled waves. She was humming softly, the same haunting tune I had heard in the archives. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She stopped humming. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow and dark. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, her expression twisted into one of anguish, and she raised a hand to point at the clock. Before I could react, the room erupted in chaos. Books flew from the shelves, scattering across the floor. The humming turned into a low, guttural wail, a sound that didn't seem possible for any human to make. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, and bolted toward the nearest exit. But the doors wouldn't open. I yanked on them desperately, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The wailing grew louder, reverberating through the walls. I turned to see the woman standing just a few feet away, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. "Why are you here?" she rasped, her voice distorted, echoing as if spoken from the depths of a cavern. "I don't know," I stammered, tears streaming down my face. She tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then she spoke again, her voice softer but no less chilling. "They won't let me leave. And now, neither can you. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was trapped, and the next I was standing outside the library, the icy wind biting at my face. The building loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if mocking me. I never returned to the Blackwood Public Library. I handed in my resignation the next day without explanation, but the nightmares have never stopped. Sometimes I wake to the sound of humming, faint and distant. Other times I see her in my dreams, standing in the shadows, her hollow eyes watching me. The locals say the library is cursed, that Evelyn Graves was only the first. They say she's still there, trapped by something older and darker than we can imagine. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they're right. If you ever visit the Blackwood Public Library, do yourself a favor. Don't stay after dark. And if you hear the humming, whatever you do, don't follow it.
Story number 5.
It was in the summer of 2019 when I began working the night shift at the Oak Ridge Historical Library, a beautiful but eerie stone building that had been standing for over 150 years. Locals often whispered about the library's other patrons, but I brushed it off as small-town superstition. I wasn't one for ghost stories. That changed during my second week on the job. The library was vast, with towering shelves of leather-bound books and dark, creaky floors that seemed to groan under the weight of time itself. My job was to reshelve books, clean the reading areas, and ensure the building was secure before locking up. It was peaceful work, at least at first. The first strange occurrence was subtle. One evening, as I was putting away books in the farthest corner of the library, I heard faint whispers. It sounded like someone murmuring under their breath, but when I looked around, the room was empty. The air felt colder in that corner, enough to raise goosebumps on my arms despite the summer heat. I told myself it was just the old ventilation system and moved on. But the whispers returned the next night and grew louder. They seemed to follow me through the stacks, growing more distinct yet still unintelligible. I thought about asking my supervisor if the library had any peculiar quirks, but I didn't want to sound ridiculous. The turning point came one Friday night. I was finishing my rounds, ensuring the building was empty before locking the doors. The main reading room was my last stop, a grand hall with vaulted ceilings, chandeliers, and long wooden tables. As I walked in, I saw that one of the chairs was pulled out, and a book lay open on the table. This was odd because I'd already cleaned that area, and no one had been inside since closing. I approached the table cautiously. The book was one I didn't recognize, bound in faded black leather with no title. Its pages were covered in strange symbols and illegible text, but scrawled across the center of one page in bold, jagged letters was a single word: run. My stomach dropped. I slammed the book shut and left it on the table, hurriedly finishing my checks. I didn't want to think about what I'd seen or what it could mean. The following week, the activity escalated. Late one night, as I worked near the archives, I heard a loud crash from the main reading room. I sprinted over, only to find several chairs tipped over and the black leather book lying open on the floor. Its pages were blank this time, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I righted the chairs and returned the book to a random shelf, hoping to forget the incident. But the library wasn't done with me. The worst night came 3 weeks into my job. I had just started my shift when I noticed that the air felt different, oppressive, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The whispers began almost immediately, louder than before and clearer. It wasn't just murmurs anymore, it was distinct voices, dozens of them, overlapping and echoing. I froze, my heart pounding. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, insistent, demanding. The lights flickered overhead, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and stretch toward me. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my keys and headed for the front door, ready to abandon my shift and quit on the spot. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. The deadbolt was stuck, and the key wouldn't turn. I yanked on the handle, my breath coming in short gasps, but the door didn't budge. Then I felt it, a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was. A woman stood at the far end of the room, partially obscured by the shadows. She was dressed in an old-fashioned black dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black as the void. Her head tilted slightly, as if curious. She took a step forward, and the room grew colder. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a chilling blend of sorrow and anger. I stumbled back, my legs shaking. "I didn't mean to," I began, but she raised a hand, and my voice caught in my throat. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening cacophony. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows twisting and writhing. Books flew off the shelves, landing with heavy thuds around me. The air crackled with static, and a faint, acrid smell of burnt paper filled my nose. The woman moved closer, her steps slow and deliberate, her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't look away. "You took it," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Bring it back." "Took what?" I stammered, barely able to form words. "The book," she hissed. "It's not yours. It's ours." Realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The black leather book. It had been out for a reason. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to return it. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted to the far corner of the library, where I'd left the book on the shelf. The shadows seemed to claw at me as I ran, and the whispers turned into screams. I reached the shelf and grabbed the book, my hands trembling. The woman was there when I turned around, her form now twisted and grotesque. Her eyes burned with fury, and her outstretched hand trembled with rage. "Put it back," she commanded. I slammed the book onto the nearest table, and the room erupted in a blinding white light. The whispers stopped, and the air grew still. When my vision cleared, the woman was gone, and the library was silent. I left that night and never returned. I quit the next day, refusing to set foot in that cursed place again. But the nightmares have never stopped. I still see her in my dreams, standing in the shadows, her hollow eyes watching me. Sometimes I wake to the faint sound of whispers, and I can't shake the feeling that she's still waiting for me to make another mistake. If you ever visit the Oak Ridge Historical Library, heed my warning. Don't touch the black leather book. Some things are better left undisturbed.
Story number 6.
It was the autumn of 2017 when I took a job as the caretaker for the old Harrington Manor Library. It was a temporary gig, meant to last just a few months while the town decided whether to renovate the building or turn it into a museum. The library was a relic from the early 1900s, its Gothic architecture both beautiful and unnerving. The locals whispered that it was cursed, but I laughed it off. A quiet job in a dusty old library sounded easy enough. The library sat at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods. It was massive, with 3 floors and countless narrow aisles lined with books. My duties were simple: keep the place clean, catalog the remaining books, and lock up at night. But from the moment I stepped inside, I felt a strange unease. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was so profound it seemed unnatural. The first few nights were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, a sense of movement in the corner of my eye, a faint sound like someone whispering just out of earshot. I told myself it was my imagination. After all, who wouldn't feel a little unsettled in a place like this? But then the noises began. Late at night, when I was alone, I'd hear footsteps echoing through the empty halls. They were slow and deliberate, always just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint their source. One night, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice echoed back at me, but there was no response. I checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. The following week, I started noticing books out of place. At first, I thought it was my own mistake. A book I was sure I had shelved would be lying open on a table the next morning. Entire sections seemed to rearrange themselves overnight. Then I found the first message. It was scrawled in the dust on one of the reading tables. "Leave." I froze, staring at the word. My logical mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a prankster had snuck in, but the library's doors were always locked, and I was the only one with the keys. I wiped the word away and tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew better. A few nights later, I was in the basement archives, cataloging old ledgers and journals. The basement was the most unsettling part of the library, cold, damp, and filled with a musty smell that clung to the air. As I worked, I heard a faint humming. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, echoing through the cramped space. I turned off my flashlight, holding my breath as I listened. The humming was coming from the far end of the room where the oldest books were stored. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept toward the sound. The closer I got, the more distinct it became. A woman's voice, haunting and melodic. When I reached the source, I found an old book lying open on a table. The pages were yellowed and blank, but the humming stopped the moment I touched it. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. I slammed the book shut and ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the book and heard the humming. I wanted to quit, but something kept me from leaving. Call it curiosity, or maybe a sense of obligation. I felt like I needed to understand what was happening. The final night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It started as usual. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and began my nightly routine. But as I walked through the library, the air grew colder, and the lights began to flicker. I heard the footsteps again, louder this time and closer. Then came the whispers, overlapping and chaotic, as if a crowd of unseen voices was surrounding me. I turned to run, but the room shifted around me. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly, the aisles twisting into a maze. The whispers grew louder, transforming into anguished cries. I stumbled forward, desperate to find the exit when I saw her. She was standing at the end of the aisle, a pale figure in a tattered dress. Her face was obscured by shadow, but her eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the darkness. She raised a hand, and the crying stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice cold and hollow. "I'm just doing my job," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. She tilted her head, studying me. "You don't belong." Before I could respond, the shelves around me collapsed, books raining down in a deafening cacophony. The lights flickered violently, and I felt an icy hand grip my arm. I turned to see her face, twisted in anguish and rage, mere inches from mine. "Leave. Leave," she hissed. "Before it's too late." I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was in the library. The next I was outside, gasping for air. I looked back to see the building dark and silent as if nothing had happened. I didn't go back to collect my belongings. I didn't even lock the door. I just left. The next day, I called the town council and quit. I told them the library needed more than a caretaker. It needed an exorcist. They laughed, dismissing my warnings as stress-induced hallucinations. But I know what I saw. The Harrington Manor Library remains closed to this day. People say it's because of budget cuts, but I know the truth. The whispers, the footsteps, the woman, they're still there, waiting. And every so often, when the wind is just right, you can hear her humming, calling out to anyone foolish enough to enter.
Story number 7.
I had always been a skeptic, laughing at tales of ghosts and the supernatural. So, when my friend Liam dared me to spend a night at the infamous Hollow Creek Library, I accepted without hesitation. The library had been abandoned for decades, its once beautiful Gothic structure now a decaying monument to a forgotten past. Locals claimed it was cursed, haunted by the librarian who had vanished without a trace in 1932. The story went that she'd been conducting some sort of strange ritual before she disappeared, leaving behind a trail of eerie whispers and an aura of dread. It was a chilly October evening when I arrived at the library, armed with nothing but a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and a sleeping bag. The building loomed in the fading light, its tall, arched windows reflecting the crimson sunset. The wrought iron gate creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty lot. Stepping inside, I was struck by how silent the place was. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped from the high, vaulted ceiling. Rows of bookshelves stood like sentinels in the gloom, their contents long forgotten. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep within. I set up camp in the main reading room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive chandelier that hung precariously from the ceiling. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I felt more excited than scared. I had the whole night to prove that the ghost stories were just that, stories. For the first hour or so, nothing happened. I explored the library, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was unnerving, but I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I even laughed at my own reflection in a dusty mirror, startled for a moment before realizing what it was. But then, as I returned to the reading room, I noticed something strange. A book lay open on one of the tables, its pages fluttering slightly despite the lack of any breeze. I hadn't seen it earlier, and I was certain I hadn't touched it. Approaching cautiously, I shone my flashlight on the page. The text was faded, almost illegible, but one sentence stood out in bold, clear letters. "You are not alone." A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but the room was empty. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to my imagination. Perhaps the wind had blown the book open, I reasoned, even though there was no wind. I closed the book and returned to my sleeping bag, determined to shake off the unease. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The library seemed to breathe with the darkness, the creaks and groans of the old building growing louder. Just as I was beginning to drift off, a noise jolted me awake. It was faint at first, a soft rustling sound, like pages being turned. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound grew louder, coming from the far corner of the room. Gripping my flashlight, I slowly stood and directed the beam toward the source. The shelves were moving. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle, almost imperceptible shifting, as if the books themselves were breathing. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the movement continued. Then, one by one, books began to fall, landing with heavy thuds that reverberated through the library. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer, but the rustling stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then, from somewhere deep within the library, I heard it. A faint, melodic humming. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet deeply unsettling. The kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I followed the sound, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the library. The humming grew louder, guiding me toward a spiral staircase that led to the upper floors. The steps groaned under my weight, and with each step the temperature seemed to drop. By the time I reached the top, I could see my breath in the air. The humming stopped abruptly as I entered a small study filled with antique furniture and faded portraits. In the center of the room stood a large desk, and on it lay an open book. The pages glowed faintly, illuminating the room with an unnatural light. I approached cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. The text on the glowing page was in a language I didn't recognize, its symbols twisting and shifting as if alive. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, and the temperature plummeted. My flashlight died, and I was left standing in the suffocating void. Then I felt it. A presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was. The figure of a woman stood in the doorway, her form barely visible in the dim light. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair hung in tangled strands over her face. Her eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the darkness. She raised a hand, pointing directly at me. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a chilling blend of sorrow and anger. "I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered, backing away. "I'll leave." But she didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer, her feet gliding soundlessly over the floor. The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing impossibly cold. The glowing book on the desk slammed shut and the humming resumed, louder and more discordant than before. The woman raised her head, and for the first time I saw her face. It was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with an unfathomable darkness. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as she whispered, "You'll never leave." The walls began to shake, and the floor beneath me cracked. Books flew from the shelves, swirling in a violent storm around the room. I screamed, dropping my flashlight as I bolted down the staircase, the woman's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, pounding on the wood, but it refused to open. Then, just as I felt her cold breath on the back of my neck, the door flew open and I stumbled outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove straight home, my hands shaking on the wheel. I never told Liam what happened that night, and I've never returned to Hollow Creek Library. It still stands there, empty and decaying, a monument to the terror that lurks within. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint humming outside my window. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down I know better.